Hey team, welcome back to our fourth and final video on medieval temperament theory. In our first video, we enjoyed the equilibrium and fair weather of spring and talked about the four primary qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness, their unique characteristics, and how they come together to inform the attributes of the elements, temperaments, and even the planets and signs in astrology. In our second video, we had a beach episode in the blazing summer and talked at length about the characteristics associated with each of the four temperaments and how they compare to one another, as well as how they accentuate different attributes associated with the qualities that make them up. In our third video, we enjoyed the spooky quiet of a crisp autumn night while my back got soaked by that water fountain, and talked about the decline of temperament theory in modern history, and how it still survives today in language and media through character tropes such as the power trio and the four temperament ensemble, explored primarily through the cast of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Now, for our final video, we're going to explore the astrology of temperament and how contemporary astrology has handled or adapted temperament. So grab yourself a cup of hot tea or cocoa and nestle up by the fire because it is April in Texas and I'm already dying in this coat. Greek medicine and Greek astrology grew up very closely alongside one another, so it's no surprise that the popularity and extended utilization of Greek medical concepts would ultimately find their way into Greek astrological technique, especially as astrology became more widely utilized as a medical tool. While we can't say for sure how widespread the adoption of astrology by medical practitioners was, we do know that several significant figures in the astrological tradition combined astrology and medicine in some fashion, such as Al-Kindi, Abu Mashar, and others. But we also know that significant figures within the medical tradition, like Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna, did not include astrology in their medical techniques. Interestingly, those that we usually associate with the astrological medicine did not appear until very late in the tradition, like Joseph Blagrave, Richard Saunders, Simon Forman, and Nicholas Culpeper, who all lived around 16th or 17th century England. The temperaments, being a very popular and fundamental component of Greek medicine, were of course very influential in astrological philosophy. We know that the signs of the zodiac were associated with one of the four elements of air, fire, earth, and water. This association occurred sometime in the 1st century CE, as we do not find these elemental associations of the zodiac signs in the writings of astrologer Vettius Valens, but we do find them in writers following pretty much immediately after him. It wasn't until a few centuries later that the four Greek elements would become associated with the four temperaments in the way that we are familiar with them today. Astrology would quickly follow suit with these assignments. The first time we see the signs of the zodiac associated not only with an element, but also specifically one of the four humors, is in the works of Salah ibn Bashir and Abu Mashar, astrologers who were contemporaries of one another, working in the beginning of the 9th century. Abu Mashar even referred to the signs as having tastes that reflect their humors. Fire signs are bitter, earth signs are sour, air signs are sweet, and water signs are salty. The associations between the signs of the zodiac and the four humors would go on to have practical applications in medicine, where physicians would often wait until the moon was in the sign associated with the humor that they were looking to purge before administering some sort of purging medication or performing bloodletting. However, and more importantly for us, many astrologers also sought to ascertain the inherent temperament from the position of planets in the birth chart. Everyone is born with their own unique mixture of the four humors, and this mixture ultimately determines things like character traits we explored in the second and third videos in this series, and even potential medical concerns that an individual may continue to struggle with throughout their lives. Astrology then, as the map to one's destiny, should be able to give us some insight into being able to identify what someone's natural temperament is. This is very important, not only because it provides clues into an individual's psychology, as we explored in previous videos, but also their health profile, and certain recommendations on diet and lifestyle can be made preventatively before someone actually gets sick. Classically, different authors would sort of prioritize their own methods to determine the temperament from the natal chart, but these temperament calculations tend to all focus on more or less the same placements. The sign and conditions of the ascendant, first house, moon, and sun are mentioned over and over again in different texts as having significant impacts on the inherent temperament. In these natal calculations, we're focused primarily on the sign placements and solar phase of specific planets, as well as those planets' own nature. In our first video, we talked about how planets and signs are associated with the 4 qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness, and it is these associations that we pull from when determining a natal temperament. That means that important placements in air signs are going to bring out that heat and moisture of the sanguine temperament to which they correspond, for example. Taking a step back, we can unpack a meaningful dichotomy in the placements that are being investigated. Because not every planet or point in the chart is considered impactful to temperament assessment, the parts that are chosen must be chosen for a reason. Taking a look at 17th century astrologer William Lilly's temperament methodology, he instructs us to look to the sign of the ascendant, moon, sun, the moon phase, planets aspecting the ascendant or in the first house, planets aspecting the moon, the planet who rules the first house, and the albutin of the figure. While the final table of all of this information may pull in a lot of influences from several planets, we're really only going to look at 5 things: the moon, the ascendant, the ruler of the ascendant, the sun, and the albutin of the figure. This is a fairly even split between planets or points that represent the soul or will of the native, and those planets or points which signify their body. This itself is a beautiful reference to the power of natal temperament, which not only has implications on personality and psychology, but is also said to affect one's vitality, constitution, and other physical medical concerns. For our points representing the body category, we have the moon and the ascendant. What's interesting is that these points can also be impressed by other planets and bring their natural humoral associations into the mix as well. If someone has their Mars square their ascendant or the moon, then Mars's hot and dry, more choleric qualities are going to be taken into account because of his association here. This is not the case for points that represent the soul, like the sun or the lord of the first house and the almutin of the figure. These are just considered basically on their own because we're leaning more into these sort of Platonic and Aristotelian ideas of the soul being more permanent and less impressionable or subject to change, especially by outside influences, than the body. Once we have our points identified and the correct humoral qualities assigned to them, we're left with a table that basically shows us our natal humoral balance and can be helpful in determining our inherent temperament. From here, therapies, regimens, and remediations may be applied to temper some of the more extreme manifestations of our temperaments to prevent them from manifesting as significant obstacles in our lives, either in the form of, say, unideal or problematic personality traits, things that kind of slow us down, or habits or even physical health challenges that may arise. Of course, being an historical technique, we don't see temperament assessment in more modern or contemporary forms of astrology. But we do have something that could qualify as a rough equivalent. Today, it's popular to assess the natal chart according to its elemental balance. There is even a section on Astro.com's natal chart generator that groups planets based on the element and modality of the sign that they are placed in. The idea is actually very similar to classical temperament theory, that people who have a lot of planets placed in one element, or a lack of planets placed in an element, will have certain experiences based on that. Different astrologers will focus on different planets or points when making their case about what does and does not qualify towards elemental points, as we'll call them. Usually the nodes, outer planets, and any additional things like asteroids or lots don't count. But the sun, moon, visible planets, and even the ascendant and the midheaven might. I don't think that this method is necessarily wrong, but there may be some problems, and I think it serves as a great illustration of the differences between the historical and contemporary philosophical framing surrounding the birth chart itself. Today, it is more common to see astrological literature that comes out of a more modern psychological school of thought. This school sees the entire natal chart as a reflection of the psyche of an individual. This means that every placement and every planet then has some direct connection and meaning to the person who is living the chart, usually as manifest in their personality, outlook, or thinking. This is in comparison to more historical viewpoints that only see very limited parts of the chart directly relate to the individual, with most other placements referring to one's experiences with other people or the areas of life that they represent. The contemporary psychological school sees the whole chart as the boat, while the historical school sees the chart more as the ocean that the boat will travel on. As a result, you can see why the historical temperament analysis focuses on a very limited part of the chart and coming up with its calculations, while more contemporary practice pulls in a lot more, as that's what the two systems see as immediately relevant. I'll put a link in the description to a few places where you can look more into the idea of elemental imbalances from a more modern psychological perspective. But there is another elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, and that is the idea of the evolution of the elements. Those of you who watched my second video where I went into the personality traits associated with the temperament and who came into it with a familiarity with more modern characterizations of the four elements may have found some of the associations confusing, especially when we talk about air and earth. The historical view of these elements doesn't exactly line up with some of the more modern interpretations that we may be more familiar with today. There is a reason for that. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who pioneered many concepts that have found their way into astrology today, such as the collective unconscious, and is the founder of the system of psychological study called psychoanalysis. Jung also had an interest in the spiritual as a descendant in a long line of preachers, and used astrology in his work. Where Jung comes into play in regards to temperament is his work Psychological Types, where he describes fundamental psychological attitudes and divides them into one of two attitudes of introverted and extroverted, and one of four functions of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Thinking is more about intellectual cognition and the forming of logical conclusions, and puts things in boxes basically of true or false. Feeling is more based on subjective value judgments, what your experience with something was, and whether it was positive or negative. Sensation is perception of reality through concrete facts, often without context or meaning, and intuition is about the perception of unconscious contents, choosing to focus instead on possibilities, what could be, and what might have been, rather than the details of what is in front of them. This system creates two pairs of opposites, with thinking being opposed to feeling, and sensing being opposed to intuiting. Of course, not counting the opposites of introvert and extrovert. While Jung does not make an explicit connection between his four functions and the four temperaments or elements, later astrologers who were influenced by his work would. In her book Relating, an Astrological Guide to Living with Others on a Small Planet, Liz Green attempts to assign the four functions an element, saying that the thinking function is air, the feeling function is water, the function of sensation is more earthy, and the intuiting function is fire. This appears to be the concretization of an ongoing transformation of elemental characteristics that began sometime in the early 1900s, as evidenced by the entry for air sign in Nicholas Devore's 1947 Encyclopedia of Astrology. This is where we start to see the air element transform from its historical associations of being social, emotionally intelligent, empathetic, and supportive into something very different. Now air is aloof, distant, cold, and intellectual, and the earth signs undergo a similar transformation, as many of Earth's historical connections with scholarship, solitude, and investigation have been handed over to air, and the earth element gets characterized as more materially focused, rustic, and in some cases, simple. The portraits of water and fire are the most similar to the historical counterparts, with maybe the expressive aspects of the water element being overstated. It's important to remember that an important part of the water elemental characterization is stoicism, not in the sense of being unfeeling, as sensitivity is another strong trait of the water element or phlegmatic temperament, but here we mean more stoic as non-reactive. So sort of this popular framing of water signs as emotional crybabies doesn't quite ring true by itself. I say all that to say that even though temperament analysis and the elemental balance technique seem like they're trying to get to the same kind of information, how you work with that information will change depending on the philosophical framework that you're working from. It may also be an indication that these two techniques are not vying to replace one another, but complement each other. Because the inherent temperament is not the same thing as modern elemental placements, they can arrive at separate conclusions, though one may be a more accurate representation of their subject. Let's look at an example. Here is the chart of Donald Trump, who I know many of us are getting tired of talking about, but he's a good example of this, I promise. Zooming into his elemental placement table on the Astro.com chart, we can see Mars, Pluto, the Ascendant, and the Moon in fire signs, Jupiter, Neptune, the Sun, Uranus, and the North Node in air signs, the midheaven in an earth sign, and Mercury, Venus, and Saturn in water signs. However, most astrologers probably will not count the nodes or the outer planets in their elemental analysis, so taking those out, we're left with 3 planets in fire signs, 2 in air signs, 1 in an earth sign, and 3 placements in water. This suggests that Trump's chart is balanced between water and fire, but as some astrologers might not really consider the MC so heavily, we might consider him mainly as being void in the earth element. The general consensus about voids is that they may manifest as one of 2 ways, either someone who is clueless or doesn't care about that element, or someone who is hyper-focused on it. So we might see someone like this as being obsessed with money and possessions, or someone who doesn't really care about it at all, someone who does not seem grounded and may move around a lot, or someone who really sinks into their environment or workplace, someone trying to kind of make up for this lack of something, someone who craves stability and loves getting caught up in the details, or someone who continually seeks change and refuses to sweat the small stuff. If I may be real, I actually hate this type of interpretational guideline. This can manifest as this, or the complete opposite of this. Like, hey, I wish we had a divinatory system with the right kinds of technique that would be able to make these kinds of very important and very different distinctions. But until then, all I can tell you is that you'll either be really healthy or you'll be really sick. Regardless whether you do or do not think of Trump as a successful business and real estate mogul, both sides will find validation with these kinds of more open this or anti-this interpretations. Switching gears to check out Trump's chart from the classical temperament analysis perspective, and oh boy do we have a completely different picture. We see a huge imbalance between heat and coldness, and again between moisture and dryness, which would indicate a highly imbalanced choleric temperament. In many ways, Trump is the embodiment of a dysfunctional choleric temperament, which is exactly what we might expect from someone with so little coldness or moisture in their system to balance them out. A lack of empathy, strong executive function, divisive, angry, hurried, petty, hurtful, tyrannical, cruel, to some charismatic, little introspection, the list just goes on and on. Obviously, it isn't a very flattering picture, and we rarely find flattering pictures when we're dealing with this level of imbalance in a natal chart. The imbalanced temperament just kind of takes over, and almost all of that person's experiences are going to be colored by that temperament's reaction style, which is not always going to be the best or most helpful, which of course trends towards the negative and extreme in its manifestations of these qualities. There is definitely a world where the temperament analysis of Donald Trump and the elemental balance analysis of Donald Trump can refer to the same person, and I think he does a good job of embodying this to some degree. I don't hate the overlap of these techniques as long as we recognize that they are coming from different places, and as long as we do away with the weak one of these 2 extremes tropes associated with the elemental balance technique. While long replaced and discredited as a pseudoscience, the 4 humors and temperament theory have made a lasting impact on our culture in the realms of language and media. These associations and characteristics still function as significant influences in astrological analysis, even if some of our wording has changed over time. In many ways, temperament analysis should be the first broad brush methodology of engaging with a birth chart, especially if one is wanting to key into medical concerns, which were not covered in this series. Hopefully this series of videos has left you with something to think about, and in closing out, I'm going to include a list of sources for further reading about this and other related topics in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching. Go with a good humor, and may your temperament be balanced.